So, this episode, I don't know if this is going to be one long episode of two separate books, or if this is going to be one episode and the next book is going to be one episode. And the reason for that is we're reading Susan Sontag's, this one is Illness as Metaphor. This book is two books put together. They're really two essays by Susan Sontag put together. So far I've only read Illness as Metaphor and want to record that first before moving on. This was read as part of, at least this section was read as part of the health and literature course that I'm taking. This is very much an essay. This is not something I would ever have read for fun, and I'm willing to admit that. However, it's also incredibly informative in the way that I now kind of view things. One of the hardest things as a 21st century reader in understanding is how everything is actually being used in its time frame, and illness is a huge part of that, because things like syphilis and so Susan Sontag uses three different illnesses in this novel, or in this essay, and it's syphilis, tuberculosis, and cancer. And the reason for that is that all three end up being kind of used as a symbol for like the downfall of humanity, the downfall of the city, the downfall of this, as like, the treachery of the world, right? It's what all three of those illnesses are used for, but they're seen and viewed in different lights. Syphilis is seen as was written as, and is kind of seen as a individual plight. It is the scorn of the individual. This individual's morals have gone awry, right? Which makes sense as we understand how syphilis, even in the 1600s, 1700s, they understood how syphilis was more or less transmitted, and how it moved from person to person. So it became kind of a scourge on the person, right? But then we start looking at tuberculosis and at cancer, which were both much more vague diseases. There was no true understanding of where they came from. There was no true, this is what causes it. And for tuberculosis, the way it works is, it often made the person look more attractive for that time period's level of what they considered attractive. It made them more attractive, and then they died. So because of that, it became the disease of sensibility. It became the disease of emotion. It became the disease of someone who is so exuberant and it just shares so much of their own life that they can't stop any diseases from hurting them, and that's like the metaphor for tuberculosis, which for me as a reader now, I don't get that unless I read Susan Sontag's essay. If we're looking at Jane Austen's novels or any other novels that feature someone that happens to have tuberculosis or TB-like symptoms, if we don't understand what the metaphor of tuberculosis is being used as, it doesn't make any sense. And the same thing goes for cancer. Cancer, this was written in late 70s, early 80s. I want to say that's when this was written. But cancer is seen as a kind of, once again, this kind of vague description of what it is, but it's also like the inability to express emotions. It is the unwantingness to go outside of your own body, and everything just kind of compiles, and that's how you get cancer. At least that's what the metaphor of cancer is. It's used in literature. People who have cancer and are diagnosed with the cancer are often people that like are so far inwards that they don't have any sort of outward type emotions. And of course this ends up changing once we get into what would be the time period after this essay was written. I would argue now at this point, different cancers are used for different things. I would argue that most cancers are, yes, still that very much the internalized anger, internalized emotion type deal. But if we look at something like breast cancer, for whatever reason, as someone who doesn't do a lot of research into cancer, breast cancer is seen more as a curable form of cancer, and because of that, it is much more likely to be used as a metaphor for someone who's outrageously strong or courageous, or just as like a stand-in for this person had breast cancer or has breast cancer, they've survived a great ordeal. It's shorthand for that, which is really, really interesting to think about when we think about how we see characters and how we create characters. And then the last part of this essay really goes on to talk about how we use cancer in the real world of writing, and how we use it in like speeches and everything. And really, Susan Sontag argues that we should stop using cancer as an adjective, or as some sort of symbol for the downfall of something. And she brings up a whole bunch of great examples of how in political speeches how they're using the word cancer as something that is destroying the world. But there's a whole bunch of great examples of how people are using cancer as kind of a stand-in for pure evil, for absolute evil, because we don't really have a concept of what that is anymore. And of course, that's bad. That is not good, because now what we're saying is every person who has cancer is dead. It doesn't matter what it is, they're dead. Because cancer is now synonymous with the evil in the world, which is not good, and we shouldn't be doing that. And that's really what most of what Sontag's work actually ends up being about is, hey, don't use these metaphors because they're not doing the world any good. They're not doing the people who are actually suffering from illness any good to use these metaphors, because all we're doing is equating them with evil and with death. Yes. Great essay. It's dense, I'll admit that. I wouldn't have read it for fun, but I'm finishing it. I think it's very, very good. I don't know if I can rate this ambiguous out of 10. I don't know. It's an essay, it's not really a narrative novel type. Anyways, that's it. That's Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor. Alright, so this is now 2 days later, after I finished the second, hello cat, after I finished the second of Susan Sontag's works that are in here, AIDS and its Metaphors. decided that I'm just going to add it on to the first one instead of making a whole separate thing. And most of that comes down to a lot of the second book in here is more of a lot of it's an expansion of the original ideas proposed in the first work. So I didn't feel like I need to really go in depth on that. However, the big thing here is AIDS. This second half really just delves into how AIDS was being treated as a metaphor for things. And the two big reasons for it are, number one, it had the social decadence and the morality factor of syphilis. 1980s into the 1990s, it still wasn't okay to be gay, right? But in Western civilizations, in the United States, in European countries, AIDS primarily affected members of the gay community, which forced or imposed this idea of morality onto the whole situation, which there wasn't much in this case that syphilis was, right? There wasn't an actual morality to all of this, but it was imposed onto it because of because of the communities that were being affected by it. But then the second part of it is it had the looming overarching effect that cancer had. Cancer diagnoses were originally thought of as the person is dead and there's nothing we can do about it. And the same went for HIV and AIDS. The idea being that once a person caught it, they were going to die. There was no, you could maybe prolong their life, but that was it. And those two things combined made AIDS into a really huge metaphor for a lot of different things that it didn't need to be. But we just impose those ideas onto a disease. The second thing to really note about this second one is Sontag's use of, or denouncing of, the military metaphor for disease. It is super common, even now, to use military metaphors for disease, and it was especially used for AIDS. It was the war on AIDS, and part of that is this overarching idea of war is a good side and a bad side, and it has victims, which by proxy, by having victims, there must also be some sort of guilt somewhere. And it is how we apply that guilt that makes things way worse than they need to be. AIDS was and is just a disease. AIDS is actually a symptom of an overarching idea of diseases. But the big thing to think about is it's just a thing. It doesn't inevitably carry certain characteristics, or it doesn't inevitably carry this or mean this or imply this or that or the other thing. It's just a thing, and we have put into it ideas of right and wrong and morality and justice because of the way that we are talking about it and the way that we use metaphors on it. The use of a war metaphor, of a military metaphor, on any sort of thing that just happens immediately makes it into an issue of good and bad and morality, which is the opposite of what we should be doing. And that is really the heart of Sontag's work, is recognizing that diseases are diseases. There is no implicit, that's the word I was looking for earlier, implicit ideas that should go beyond that. We should not be thinking of AIDS as this somehow inhumane thing. We should not be thinking of cancer as this inevitable death. We should not be thinking of tuberculosis as this thing that means that we have more sympathy and more empathy than the regular person. They're diseases, and they should be treated as such. Yeah, and that's really the core of Sontag's work, or at least my interpretation of it. It's a dark one, but it's a real one, and it's one that is still important to this day. So yeah.